Now in tonight's Archive Hour, Brian Sibley, who adapted that radio version, considers the many ways in which different artists have been inspired to make their own versions of the epic tale.
As you can see, we have a wonderful collection of statues here, the most popular being Gandalf, which has got a fantastic likeness of Sir Ian McKellen. He authorised the statue to say it was a true likeness of himself.
What more could you want? Unless it were a ring like the one in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings that has the ability to make one invisible. But then at just $12.99, I guess that's somewhat unlikely.
Unfortunately, right now we have currently sold out of the One Ring, so we are waiting for the One Ring to come back in stock.
Wait. There are markings. It's some form of Elvish. I can't read it.
There are few who can. The language is that of Mordor, which I will not utter here.
Mordor?
We have a nice chess set, which is very good, in sort of a pewter and bronze effect. It has, obviously, all the Fellowship on one side and then all of Sauron's evil henchmen on the other.
The merchandising bonanza attending the Fellowship of the Ring, the first part of Peter Jackson's movie trilogy based on Tolkien's epic tale, would be truly staggering were it not simply the latest evidence of our passionate obsession with this book. I know that there are some, well, probably quite a lot really, who loathe it, but there are plenty more of us who love it. And those of us who do, well, we simply can't get enough of it, in just about any shape or form.
I still read the book every year, and have done ever since it came out.
Christopher Lee, who plays Saruman in the film The Fellowship of the Ring.
I still think it's just so wonderful, the imagination behind it.
Tolkien once wrote that he was engaged in creating a mythology that might leave scope for other hands wielding paint and music and drama. True, he added that this notion was probably absurd, but as we shall be exploring in this programme, artists, dramatists, composers and filmmakers have been doing just that for nearly 50 years.
It could actually be a lifetime job wandering around in Middle-earth, doing sketches and rendering things.
It is a very comfortable landscape to inhabit, in that there are very clear-cut moral issues.
One of the interesting things about Lord of the Rings is the amount of depth that Tolkien put into his world, and he goes to great pains to describe the worlds of hobbits and of elves and of dwarves and of men, and they're all different. So when these races come together on this quest as the Fellowship of the Ring is a group of these different people.
Stories are told of Sauron's fall, long ago.
That is so, but always, after a respite, the shadow takes another shape and grows again. He's fast becoming very strong, and he lacks but one thing to give him strength and knowledge to beat down all resistance, break the last defenses, and cover all the lands in darkness. He lacks the One Ring.
For J.R.R. Tolkien, a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, the story had begun years earlier with the writing of another book. It was called The Hobbit. In spinning that yarn, Tolkien sent the Hobbit, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, on an adventure-filled journey, in the course of which he encountered a pathetic yet dangerous creature called Gollum.
The Hobbit must have a competition with us precious.
And found a ring that possessed incredible magical powers.
Ask us a riddle.
What have I got in my pocket?
Not fair! Not fair! That's not the riddle. It isn't fair, my precious. It isn't fair to ask us what it's got in its nasty little pocket.
What have I got in my pocket?
If you're a hobbit, you'd like to smoke a pipe of tobacco, drink some good ale, and eat plenty of food. Three things which you can do here, where I am now, a public house in Oxford, a very famous public house. Its name is the Eagle and Child, and the inn sign shows an eagle flying across a mountain landscape with a child hanging from its talons. Here in Oxford, it is known, and has always been known, as the Bird and Baby. And it was to this pub, indeed right to where I'm standing now beside the fireplace on a high-backed wooden settle, that a group of men used to come every week and read to each other from the books that they were writing. They called themselves the Inklings. They called themselves that because it was a title which suggested that they had an inkling about the things that they wanted to tell people, and they were also involved in the very inky business of writing their stories down. That group of writers included two people who have become among the most influential of fantasy writers of the 20th century. And above the fireplace, there are not only a group of photographs of these men, but also a letter which is addressed to the landlord of the Eagle and Child, which says, "The undersigned, having just partaken of your ham, have drunk your health." The first of those signatories is that of C.S. Lewis, the creator of the Chronicles of Narnia. The last name on the list is that of John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, the creator of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And there seems to be about Oxford something that attracts people who want to weave tales of the fantastic. Long before C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, there was Lewis Carroll. And still today, writers of the fantastic live in Oxford and write in Oxford. One of them is the best-selling and highly successful writer Philip Pullman.
I don't know what it is about Oxford. I don't know whether Oxford creates these strange things or whether people are drawn to Oxford because of its associations. I think my own theory is it's to do with the river and the mists on the river which come out at night and dissolve the stonework.
We can guess what it's got in his pockets, can't we, precious? We've lost it, yes. He's found it.
If you look at some certain gargoyles, they're never the same from one day to the next. They've changed their expressions. Strange things happen in this city, and it's probably to do with that it has this effect on writers who come to live here.
The author of His Dark Materials, a trilogy almost as long as Tolkien's, Philip Pullman is the ideal person to tell us why stories about quests, and this one in particular, so readily capture our imagination.
It is a quest story. There is a task to be done, and a humble sort of person to do it. Now, when you have a quest story, three things must operate if it's to be any good. Firstly, a lot must hang on the outcome. It's no good Frodo doing all that stuff if the only thing that happens at the end is that he's finally passed his driving test. That's not important enough. The fate of the world has got to hang on it. The second thing is the quest, the task itself must be hard to do. It must be full of danger and difficulty. But the third thing is that it must be easy to understand. Now, what Frodo has to do is a very simple thing. He has to take the ring to the heart of the enemy country and drop it into the volcano, and then everything will be all right. And whatever he's doing and wherever he goes and wherever in the book we are, we can always relate what's going on to that simple task. So those three laws of the quest, I think, are very clearly exemplified and fulfilled in The Lord of the Rings, and that's why it works as a quest story.
Why do we need those quest stories, then?
We need all sorts of stories. I think we don't need that sort of story as much as we need realistic stories. My view of fantasy is that it's inherently a trivial form, a form of less importance than realism. And speaking for myself, if I could write interesting stories about everyday lives of ordinary people, I would gladly do that. I can't do that and make it interesting, so I have to write fantasy.
Another thing that fascinates me, and it's something which, well, you might say you don't have in common with Tolkien, but the story stems from the real world. He was adamant that Middle-earth was not some parallel universe. It wasn't somewhere you reached through the wardrobe, through the looking glass, down the rabbit hole. You weren't taken there by a cyclone. It was this world in some past time. And that, I suggest, is one reason why people feed on it so hungrily, because it does seem, for all the fantastical qualities that it has, to be rooted in this world.
Yes, well, if he said that, that's the purest bunkum. I will believe that when they find a fossil hobbit. It's not the real world. But there are large numbers of fantasy fans who hold fantasy conventions and read nothing but fantasy books and know a great deal about every detail of the saga of the Doom Sword or Flothelfroth or whatever it is, but who don't know what day it is and haven't changed their T-shirt for a month, and clearly they're getting something out of it. What they get out of this sort of genre and this sort of thing is a mystery to me, because I don't get it.
Don't tell that to a fan like Emma Gilson of London's fantasy store Forbidden Planet.
People think we're all geeks to read, fantasy books. It's pathetic. These books, I think, they're very much based on human emotion. Everything that Frodo and the Hobbits went through was, we go through those same kind of feelings and thoughts.
So, there you have the first dilemma. The next is almost as insoluble. If you like fantasy worlds, do you want to see them depicted, or just keep them as images in the eye of your imagination? To begin with, The Lord of the Rings was a book without pictures. Maps, yes, and emblematic designs of rings and fiery eyes on the bindings and dust wrappers, but no illustrations. And yet, curiously, Tolkien himself was an enthusiastic artist. Wayne Hammond, co-author of J.R.R. Tolkien, artist and illustrator.
He was an amateur artist, but an amateur in much the best sense, in that he enjoyed painting and drawing. He was especially good at landscape, not so good at figures. It was very useful to him later on when he was writing his mythology, because he could work out details of the text in pictures. However, he also could draw from his imagination, which is a very difficult thing to do.
Tolkien made his own pictures for The Hobbit, but when it came to The Lord of the Rings, he was keen to commission illustrations from a real artist, Pauline Baynes. We think of Tolkien's characters as being very particular, all kinds of things, dwarves, elves, and so on. But he saw them rather differently, didn't he? Or perhaps rather simply, in a way.
I got the idea that they were just people of different heights or different ways of living. And the only strange thing was the Hobbit with the fur feet. And I said, did they look any different, or how should I do them? And he got quite testy and said, they're just ordinary people.
In the end, it proved too costly to add pictures when the book was first published in 3 volumes between 1954 and 1955. Nevertheless, Pauline Baynes, who later illustrated C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, created a memorable cover design that was, for those of us reading the book in the 60s, our one and only window onto Middle-earth. Jane Johnson of Tolkien's publishers, HarperCollins.
There's branches, aren't there? There's trees that go up on either side, and you're looking through a vista through those branches, so you're drawn into the picture. And I was rather fascinated by the idea of being drawn into a landscape in that sort of way, an otherworldly landscape. And from that day on, I felt that I was in some way inhabiting Middle-earth, that I had found a home, and I went back to it again and again in a very short period of time, so that it became almost a sort of secondary reality to me, so a place that I could visit at will.
I just wanted to do the background, to set the stage, so to speak.
Very English in the landscape? Was that the driving thing?
Half and half. Some Oxfordshire, some make-believe, you know.
Christina Scull, co-author of Tolkien, artist and illustrator.
There have been many more illustrations of The Lord of the Rings. Some of them are very sword and sorcery. Some of them are very strange. I've seen a German one with a very twee elf king and some very drunken butlers. The first Portuguese one has Bilbo wearing a sort of pointed hat, a great smile, and surrounded by mushrooms, so one almost feels that he may have been one of the hippie children. The first Swedish one had some rather, well, one illustration looks as if it belongs to Rider Haggard, and another has a huge golem that's just like a blob. The second Swedish one was in fact illustrated by Tove Jansson, very famous Swedish artist.
Creator of the Moomins.
Yes, and in fact I'm afraid her golem looked like a huge moomin, about 10 times the size of Bilbo.
What we have generally used here at HarperCollins and previously at Allen and Unwin was tended to be Northern European artists, because Lord of the Rings and the whole Silmarillion cycle was created as a mythology of England and was very specifically about Northern Europe. And Tolkien himself said that the work that he was engaged in should possess the air and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the northwest, Britain and the hither parts of Europe, while possessing the fair elusive beauty that some call Celtic. It should be high, purged of the gross, and fit for the adult mind of a land long now steeped in poetry. So for me, the paintings that have really worked best fit that bill. They have had that elusive quality. There's been a lot of American artwork over the years which has been a lot more brightly coloured and more obvious, for want of a better word.
Well, a better word might be garish, actually.
It takes the characters full on. They look out at you, at the reader, as if they're engaging in dialogue with you, which I don't believe they should. We are looking into their world. They are not there to provide entertainment for us in that sort of way. When we commissioned Alan Lee to illustrate The Lord of the Rings, Alan was the perfect artist for this task because he tends to go for the oblique view.
Here is Alan Lee, a shy and reluctant interviewee, speaking on a rare archive recording about his view of Tolkien's world.
He's a very visual writer. I find the landscapes he describes very, very rich. The landscape of the Shire I've modelled quite closely on my own locality, near to Dartmoor in Devon. It's a certain type of unchanged English landscape which is very gentle, very rolling hills and green pastures and woods.
And I like that. Alan leaves you lots of room for your own imagination.
In contrast, John Howe is an artist who sets out again and again to capture exactly the moment of drama, of confrontation.
I don't think any of us have quite the graphic imagination that John Howe has.
I think a picture should be a sort of a helping hand. It should be an open door. It should be a horizon with a bit of mist, and it should be things that actually take you farther into the text, stimulate the imagination rather than supplying a lot of answers.
What opportunities does Tolkien's world present to you as an artist?
A few millennia of European history, both mythological and purely historical. I mean, one of my favourite anecdotes is when Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas are arriving in Edoras, and there is two lines of tombs of kings of Rohan just as they're crossing the river before they arrive at Edoras. And the names of these kings have nothing etymologically to do with the actual kings of Rohan, so you can imagine another line of kings which has become extinct, generations and generations of culture which have simply disappeared. And I find that to be really exciting. That really stimulates me, that really opens up my imagination, I think.
You've also been drawn to some particular incidents again and again and again. You're particularly fond of that great confrontation between Gandalf and the Balrog.
Balrog is also one of Tolkien's greater creations in that he barely describes it, and it has spawned all sorts of wonderful debates. Does it have wings? Does it not? And internet freaks are happily arguing about that, and they've been arguing about it for years. So much is left up to the imagination.
One of those pictures that I find particularly haunting the confrontation between Gandalf and the Balrog, not when it's first described in the book, but in fact just a passing reference to the fact that they battle on the top of this great mountain called Saraxigel.
That's right. You have the highest peak in the White Mountains, which you can reach by the endless stair, which has already so many wonderful words and images, and they clamber all the way up to the very top, and the Balrog bursts into flame again, and they fight until Gandalf is so weary he actually dies before he's carried away to be reborn. I thought once again, it's William Blake, very stimulating.
Together with Alan Lee, John Howe spent time in New Zealand, creating a very specific look for Peter Jackson's film trilogy.
One of the things that was so appealing in the film job is that there we were allowed to sort of wander into Bag End, wander around, wonder where the kitchen was, how it was set up, what Bilbo's desk would be like. And all of those things were such a treat, because you never get that kind of luxury when you're simply doing illustrations one after another. So it was a real working holiday in that sense. Yeah, working holiday in Middle-earth. Spend a year abroad, see the sights, meet the hobbits, draw the Balrog. It was, very exciting.
Pictures are one thing. Moving pictures, whatever freedom they may offer the conceptual artist, are something altogether different. And yet there's been no shortage of attempts to translate Tolkien's works into other media, beginning in the author's own lifetime with the stage, and a school performance of The Hobbit in Oxford, which Tolkien stoically attended and afterwards inscribed copies of his books for the young members of the cast. Since then, there have been several professional productions of The Hobbit, the most recent of which was directed by Roy Marsden.
It's very difficult to absolutely nail what is Tolkien and how to tell the story best. Do you remember on television there used to be a game show called The Crystal Maze? Now, in The Crystal Maze, there was a group of people constrained by time and by fear of losing each other, had to overcome a set of obstacles. And as soon as they'd overcome one, they were on to the next and on to the next. And in the end, they won the treasure. And in a sense, it's that journey, except underpinning it all is what Tolkien is writing about, and that is, the morality of this curious world called Middle-earth.
Any thoughts on Gandalf? There's this strange character, mercurial. He arrives at the beginning, he instigates the adventure, and then disappears off the scene.
It's a real problem, isn't it? Because it lends itself to obediently to some Judaic-Christian belief and understanding that there is God, but it's a sort of wonderful hands-off God that is there to help and encourage, but then says there is a moment in your life when you have to be free, where you have to make the choice, but then at the last moment comes back and says, oh, that's a bit heavy for you, I'll just help you through that one, you're not quite ready. And in a curious way, that's exactly what Gandalf does. How to make it dramatic, the idea that halfway through the play, he suddenly looks at his watch and says, oh, I've got to get a bus, I've got to go somewhere else, doesn't necessarily motivate the audience as they look at it and think, oh, I enjoy Gandalf, where's he gone?
More than 20 years ago, I have vivid memories of seeing actor Rob Inglis tackling not The Hobbit, but The Lord of the Rings, and doing it as a one-man show. This is how he described the experience to Michael Oliver on Kaleidoscope.
I use a table and a few chairs and a lectern. I put a chair on top of this table and get on top of that to be the Lord of the Nazgul riding above the battle. I put on a sleeve for Gollum so that when he appears over the top of a lectern, it can come as a bit of a surprise. There's just time in a pause to put that sleeve on.
Cautious. We mustn't risk our neck, must we? No. Where is it? The precious, it's ours, and we want it. The thieves, the filthy little thieves, where are they with the precious? Curse them. We hate them.
It's 1,000 pages, this book. I suppose your dramatisation takes a couple of months, does it?
It now takes less than 2 hours with interval, but it was longer to start with. First of all, I had to get a précis of every chapter. I've tried to keep some very important sections almost intact. and then, where I could, reduce one chapter to a sentence, just as a link. I made the mistake initially in performance of saying that one sentence quickly. I find if I replace a chapter with a sentence, I at least have to say the sentence slowly.
Whether you are a solo performer or part of a full cast production, there is also, as Roy Marsden explains, the audience factor.
Of course, you get all of those people which are curious and delightful who turn up wearing, full costume. Well, you get that happens a lot.
As what? What do they do?
Well, they're mostly dressed as Bilbo. Their image of Bilbo is quite a lot of Gandalfs as well. People turn up with grey beard and funny hats.
That must be difficult if you're sitting behind them.
Well, it is. Excuse me, can you take your hat off? And it goes on and on. But I think they come for the sheer delight of just being involved.
Roads go ever, ever on, over rock and under tree, by caves where never sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea, over snow by winter sown, and through the merry flowers of June, over grass and over stone, and under mountains in the moon.
Music for The Hobbit by Mark Bloxage, one of numerous compositions in just about every conceivable musical style, from heavy metal to new age, that have been inspired, in one way or another, by Tolkien's writings. Just as the author of The Lord of the Rings has proved to be all things to all people, from hippie cult master to ecological crusader, from anti-bomb protester to spiritual visionary, so his book has sparked the composition of all kinds of musical expression. One of the earliest of which, and I still have the well-worn LP to prove it, was Bo Hanson's 70s album of musical sketches from Middle-earth called simply Lord of the Rings. Whilst Tolkien was no musician, The Lord of the Rings is full of music. As we move through the cultures of Middle-earth, we hear it in our heads, the elven harps of Lothlorien, the dwarf drums of Moria, or perhaps the fiddle and flute jollity of the Hobbit lands. All themes which are woven into the Lord of the Rings symphony by Johann de May. The pages of The Lord of the Rings are crammed with verses and poems that cry out to be sung. And sung they have been, in a diversity of styles to suit just about every taste. Well, more or less. The settings by fantasy writer Marion Zimmer Bradley, for example, are suffused with Celtic wonderment.
Sing all ye joyful, now sing all together. The wind's in the treetop, the wind's in the heather. The stars are in blossom, the moon is in flower, and bright are the windows of night in her tower. Dance all ye joyful, dance all together. Soft is the grass and let foot be like feather. The river is silver, the shadows are fleeting. Merry is Maytime and merry our meeting.
Other musicians, like the Dutch band The Hobbitans, are clearly steeped in the real ale-knitted waistcoat world of pseudo-folk music.
The road goes ever on and on, and from the door where it began, how far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow if I can. The yalla-la-la, 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 yalla-la-la-la-la-la-la-la. Pursuing it with eager feet until I join some larger way where many pass and errands meet, and whither then I cannot say. The yalla-la-la, 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 yalla-la-la-la-la-la-la-la.
Tolkien himself was particularly keen on the song settings made by Donald Swann of the celebrated partnership of Flanders and Swann, famous for such comic numbers as The Gas Man Cometh and Mud, Mud, Glorious Mud. In a radio programme broadcast in 1975, Donald Swann performed several of his Tolkien songs, including this one, which is preceded by a recording of the author himself reading in his created language of Elvish.
Arel berethgil foniel, sidivren penamiriel o menel aglar elenath, nachaired palandiriel o galathremmin enorath, fanuilos lelinathon, nevaya si nevayaron.
Ael berethgil thoniel, silivren penamiriel, o menel aglar elenath, nachaired palandiriel, o galas reminen orath, fanuilos lelinathon, nevair si nevayaron, nevayaron.
In 1978, the film composer Leonard Rosenman got a crack at The Lord of the Rings. He was commissioned to write the score for an animated feature film directed by Ralph Bakshi. There had been talk of a film of the book for many, many years, and the well-known American writer Forrest J. Ackerman had had discussions with Tolkien about a film in the 1950s. Nothing came of that idea, largely because the author was less than amused by a proposed synopsis that not only consistently misspelled his characters' names, but also changed the wizard into an eagle, a good trick if you can do it, and referred to the elven stronghold of Lothlorien as a fairy castle. Tolkien had died by the time Ralph Bakshi came to make his film, which, despite a number of shortcomings, boasted an exceptional vocal cast. I was quite a young man when I saw the film, and although I was rather disappointed by it, I know I certainly came out of the cinema doing a hissing impersonation of Gollum. To provide the voice for this wonderfully slimy Trixie character, Ralph Bakshi engaged an actor better known for his stage performances in the plays of Beckett and Pinter, Peter Woodthorpe.
It all began with the film, and I'd never read Lord of the Rings. I knew nothing about it. And I just thought, yes, and so I thought I'll have a go here. And so I had a go, a vocal go. I did his Gollums and Skreel and Smeagol and Deagle and all those things. And one hardly spent any time there, and suddenly one had got the part of Gollum. And I didn't know what Gollum was, and one started to record it that next day. I just took the money and ran. I enjoyed doing it.
Did they show you any pictures of the characters? I mean,
no.
when you started,
no,
you
hadn't
didn't
decided
know...
on them.
So you didn't know what Gollum, his idea of Gollum looked like?
No. One of the art of doing real performance in a fantasy situation is to mean it, and to be involved in it, and it to be real to you. And anyway, they took it away. And then the next we heard was about a year later, or I don't remember. It seemed forever. But by this time, they'd played it in America, and Gollum was a smash. And they brought the head over of Gollum for me to wear and go around to film introduction meetings and everything else.
Was this a likeness of the character in the film?
Yes, they brought it over and wanted me to put it on.
Was it rubber or...?
It was rubber, and it was rubber and kind of hideous, and I stood with it and had photos taken of it. It was a monster mask, and it's how it appeared, and Gollum showed up very well.
The Lord of the Rings was to have been the first of two films based on Tolkien's book, but failure at the box office meant that it was never completed. However, as we shall hear, Peter Woodthorpe was far from finished with Middle-earth, or Gollum. It was in 1980 that I was crazy enough to propose to the BBC that they might consider a radio dramatisation of The Lord of the Rings. I made the suggestion with all the seriousness of a seriously unemployed writer, but with little hope of its actually happening. So imagine my astonishment when I discovered that the BBC was, at that precise moment, in the midst of negotiations to acquire the radio rights to Tolkien's book. Years earlier, in fact shortly after publication, The Lord of the Rings had been semi-dramatised on the third programme, a venture with which Tolkien was singularly unimpressed, dismissing it as a sillification. Not a good omen, I thought, as I began the daunting task of preparing the 1,000-page long book for serialisation in 26 weekly parts. The writing of the episodes was divided between myself and Michael Bakewell, and producer Jane Morgan began the quest for a composer to score the series. The task eventually fell to the late Stephen Oliver.
Which was an accident. I'd asked an agent for the availability of somebody more famous, and he said...
Oh, go on, let's say who.
Well, it was Malcolm Arnold, who I hoped might do it. And, I mean, he's a great composer, and I'd have loved to have heard his music, but I'm also very glad that I heard Stephen Oliver's. It was a wonderfully electric sound, and it swirled out at you, didn't it?
One of the things I think of as when I think of his music is that it is quintessentially English music. You mentioned Malcolm Arnold, but I think of Vaughan Williams, John Ireland, Arnold Bax. These are the people who, in a sense, are there, though transformed in Stephen's music.
Yes, and she was aware of that. And we also had private jokes, which were the Vaughan Williams moments and which were the Henry Purcell moments. The elves were very much more Purcellish than the Aragorn and co.
One of the singers who worked with Stephen Oliver on the series was someone who is now better known as a leading wine expert, Oz Clarke.
He's quite brilliant at catching a mood when Stephen is in the Golden Forest, and he uses xylophones and tubular bells and things. You've just got a sense. You don't need any pictures. You just have a wonderful sense of this golden forest full of calm and beauty. And Stephen paints a picture of purity and gentleness and calm.
I think the music does play a great part, and I think the songs, the feeling of that brotherhood, of the fellowship of the ring, the songs were rather good for that.
Stephen said, I've got another song for you to sing. I said, great, fantastic, where is it? And he said, well, get a piece of paper out and note this down. And then he started singing the tune. He said, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-da-dum, and that which is and then he said, okay, here are the words. In western lands beneath the sun, the flowers may rise in spring. I said, hang on, yes, got this down. And I have to say, I've got the piece of paper still, this actual piece of paper that I just transcribed what Stephen said out of his head. And Stephen said, have you got the tune? I said, I've got the tune. And he said, okay, Sam Ganges is in his cell. He's thinking of the golden, gentle days of the Shire. He's desperately searching for his boss. He can't find him. It's cold and it's miserable. And he's singing about somewhere warm and somewhere soft and somewhere gentle. And he said, off you go. And I picked up my piece of paper and sang, in western lands beneath the sun, the flowers may rise in spring. You know, trying to just sing it.
The trees may bud, the waters run, the merry finches sing.
I had a friend who arranged for me to go to North Wales, and it was on the estuary, and I must have gone in about October, November. And I'd work all day, and about sort of 5:30 walk up the estuary and hear the birds calling. There's strange cries of birds, which sort of did become some of the, in my head, the Nazgul flying through the air. And the water, I suppose, because of all the rivers that the battles take place round rivers.
Or there may be 'tis cloudless night, and swaying beaches bear the elven stars as jewels white amid their branching hair.
Were there certain effects that were hard?
The ring itself we did in the music session, sort of by chance, didn't we? Wasn't it? It was a glass.
It was on the edge of glasses,
yes,
I believe.
Yes. We didn't have to tinker about with funny electronic effects. I was adamant that we shouldn't do that one should not radiophonic it out of existence.
Casting the series was unalloyed fun. What about John Le Mesurier as Bilbo? Could we possibly get Robert Stevens to play Aragorn?
Ian Holm was always, I couldn't believe my luck that he was willing to take it on. Ian has an ability to take things off the page in a most brilliant way and try unexpected things. The marvellous moment when we were throwing the ring into the crack of doom, and he did it, and we were in tears in the box. I remember Stephen Oliver saying, "Who's playing Frodo?" And I said, "Ian Holm." And he said, "Well, then you don't need music."
Mr. Frodo! I have come, but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine.
I worried subsequently that I cast so many hobbits of people of not very tall stature. The hobbits did tend to be quite short.
And there was also, of course, Peter Woodthorpe on his second outing as my precious Gollum.
And you know the way there, I believe. Didn't want them to go, did we? No, precious. Not the nice hobbits, ashes, ashes and dust and thirst there is. And pits, and orcs. Thousands of orcs, nice hobbits mustn't go to those places. So you have been there.
It isn't Frodo that fulfills the quest at all. It's Gollum that fulfills the quest. It's Gollum that takes the ring by force, and in doing so falls into the crack of doom and takes with him the ring. It's odd that, isn't it? That it isn't the hero who really does in the end carry through the quest. It's the villain, it's Gollum.
It's the villain who steals the quest from him. I get a lot of letters from it, still. Quite amazing. And this fan club that's in America, they tried to get me the part in this film, you know. The fan club. I didn't even know the fan club existed. And I got this wonderful letter, and the letter they'd written to the director, Peter Jackson. Well, he turned them down because he was going to do gobbledygook with it. I can't think of the name.
Gollum is really created in the film using computer graphics.
That's
or
right.
CGI as it's called.
I suppose it works magnificently. It's a new means. But he didn't want me because we were going to go as a CGI, and I didn't best like that because I thought there might be some loot and a trip to New Zealand.
One member of the cast fared a little better. 20 years on, Ian Holm was perhaps a little too old to recreate his original role of Frodo in the new movie, but New Zealand film director Peter Jackson invited him instead to play Frodo's uncle, Bilbo. Jackson, it turned out, had a gratifying respect for our old radio series, which was nice, and I was relieved to discover on visiting the sets that he also had a refreshingly down-to-earth take on the considerably risky business of filming the fantastic.
I'm never imagining a particular actor, like I'm not imagining Sean Connery as Gandalf or Anthony Hopkins as Bilbo or anybody particularly. I'm just imagining sort of as anyone reading the book would. You know, you have an amorphous mental image of what Bilbo would look like or Gandalf would look like, and you're sort of carrying the responsibility of every character is on your shoulders. That, you know, somebody says, would Gandalf's staff be like this? And it's like, oh, Gandalf's staff. Aragorn's sword, oh yeah. You know, what jacket would Frodo wear? Oh, right. And so you're carrying the weight of every character in the book on your shoulders, trying to make these decisions of what your characters do. And then finally, when the actors come on board, they sort of take that over. They all start to own their characters, and it takes a huge amount of responsibility from me. At that point is when I'm really free to actually make the movie. And then the actors create characters which totally define and excite you, because, again, almost without exception, what the actors are doing is usually better than what you imagine.
I cannot do this alone.
You have my sword.
And you have my bow.
And my axe.
This task was appointed to you, and if you do not find a way, no one will.
The enemy has many spies. Birds, beasts.
Something draws near. I can feel it. Get off the road!
Hide! You must remember, Frodo, the ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found. Let us hope that our presence may go unnoticed.
A lot of people have done fantasy films of the legends and labyrinths and dark crystals and willows and krulls and all the different types of fantasy, and even going back, I guess, to the Harryhausen movies. And I mean, I'm doing what I do today because of King Kong and the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and those movies. But nonetheless, there's that type of sword and sorcery type stuff which I don't think had ever been done well. So I was intrigued and saying, well, what is it about all these films that I don't like? I thought, well, hang on, I'd love to do Lord of the Rings in a way that to me was my take on fantasy, of what I always wished a fantasy film would be, but have never actually seen one. What I always felt a fantasy film should be like is to keep it very real, and that it should feel like it has a sense of history, of past. At the end of the day, when you're saying, well, if there's one element of Lord of the Rings that I wanted to preserve, I mean, that was making it feel authentic, historical, in a real world. Never let the movie art department sort of take over the storytelling, and also never let the characters get swallowed up in gobbledygook dialogue and sort of silly-looking costumes and all that sort of stuff. I have a very simplistic approach to what movies should be. You have to create a series of questions in the audience's mind, compelling questions and doubts and things that they wonder about, and then strategically reveal the answers to people as the film develops. I mean, it sounds very simple, but if people are not asking themselves any questions as the film goes along, you basically at that point have a dull, boring film.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces at work in this world, Frodo, besides the will of evil. Bilbo was meant to find the ring, in which case you also were meant to have it. And that is an encouraging thought.
The creation of a fantasy world that had all the grittiness and time-soiled weariness of real life presented a challenge for composer Howard Shore.
I wanted the score to have a sound of antiquity. I wanted it to feel old, as if you had discovered the score somewhere in a vault. There's fiddle and bodhran is used quite a bit. There's Irish drums, and there's also beautiful guitar and a hammered dulcimer and penny whistles and that,
Clearly what was required was a movie score which would not be categorized simply as conventional fantasy film music.
I looked to opera for structure and for scope. That was the closest musical form that I could find that related to writing essentially a 9-hour piece, because you're writing to 3 films. In a few years, actually, there'll be a 9-hour version of Lord of the Rings, and the music must have that shape to it. So I think of Fellowship as Act 1.
You mentioned the Fellowship. Often in a film you've got a central character so that you can create a theme for that character and the audience immediately identifies with that. Here you've got 9 central characters in the Fellowship of the Ring.
Yes, well aware of that, and tried to create the Fellowship theme. First when Frodo's leaving Hobbiton with Sam on his way to Bree, and you hear sort of a very fragmented piece of it, and they're sort of afraid it's the first time they've left the Shire, and it's a very sort of tentative reading of that with the orchestra. And then they meet Merry and Pippin in the cornfield, and it's a more kind of frolicking, it's a little more upbeat. There's now 4 of them, and they finally get to Bree. It's very intimidating, and they meet Strider, and they leave Bree, and you hear the Fellowship is now 5. So it's the piece, when you hear it in the film, has formed a little more, but it's still quite arduous. And finally reaching Rivendell, they think that they've completed the journey, but they realize they must go on, but they have great help now from Legolas and Gimli, and Gandalf is there, of course, to help them. And it's a joyous rendition of it. It's like the 9 of them setting out on a great mission, and very sort of heroic, upbeat kind of version of it. And then as the Fellowship progresses through Moria, you hear different readings of it in context of after defeating the cave troll. There's a very victorious version of it. But then after Gandalf dies, the Fellowship is starting to come apart, and Boromir is more and more tempted by the ring's power. It starts to break apart, and the theme does as well. In Boromir's death, you hear a very solemn, very processional version of the Fellowship theme. So I was looking for material that I could develop through 9 hours of the story, and we wanted a feeling of antiquity, of it being old.
Ancient, timeless, but does it have anything to say? Some, like novelist Philip Pullman, think not.
My quarrel with Tolkien is that he did believe that human nature was fiction. He said nothing interesting about it. What I have tried to do through the medium of fantasy is to say something that I think is true and important about human beings. I don't find that Tolkien does this. And it's partly to do with the absence of, the total absence of sexuality in the book. What he could have done with the love between Aragorn and Arwen, for example, or whatever it is colossal compared with what he did do, which was just to sort of back away from it in a prim late Victorian way and draw a veil over it and say nothing and hope that it would go away, probably.
Others aren't particularly bothered about the absence of sex in The Lord of the Rings, perhaps because there seems so much else in Tolkien's grand design on which to focus. Simple, honest human affection, loyalty, devotion, self-sacrifice, and single-minded courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Publisher Jane Johnson.
I think Tolkien produced something absolutely archetypal in The Lord of the Rings. He did say that he was setting out to make a mythology for England at the time, and I genuinely think that he achieved that to a very large level. He's drawing on the roots of fiction. The very earliest fiction that mankind ever produced was myth and legend and moral tales of this nature, and it has tremendous resonance as a result. I think it speaks to something in us of an ancient past and of a sort of mourning for a lost golden age as well. And I still think that that is why fantasy, from Tolkien to Harry Potter, speaks so clearly and so strongly to such a wide audience even now.
Look along the shelves of any library or bookshop and consider the sheer, mind-boggling weight of printed matter that has been, it could be argued, inspired by The Lord of the Rings. Great fat 3-volume epics, 7-volume epics in some cases. These works are part of the legacy of J.R.R. Tolkien. Passports and visas for the imagination of 21st century man. Philip Pullman again.
I do think that in the course of our evolution we have evolved the need and the desire to make patterns, whether it's patterns of sound or colour or whatever it is. And one way of making patterns is in language and through telling stories. This is something that we might as well consider a given because we can't go back to a time when we didn't have it. This is the way we are. And it gives us pleasure to hear stories, to read stories, and it gives some of us enormous and intense pleasure to make up stories.
And that is why when those of us who fall under Tolkien's spell reach the end of The Lord of the Rings, we feel a sense of sadness, of loss. I'd personally go so far as to describe it as a bereavement. Then the only thing to do is to, start again at page 1, or pore over the paintings and drawings of the Tolkien illustrators, or put on another CD of Middle-earth music, or go and see the movie, or maybe listen to the radio series again. I shall leave the final farewells to Mr. Bilbo Baggins, the hobbit whose escapades began the whole fantastical adventure. At the very end of The Lord of the Rings, Bilbo, along with Frodo and the other ring-bearers, embark from the shores of Middle-earth and sail away into the west. Long after completing the book, Tolkien wrote a poem about their departure, Bilbo's Last Song, he called it, which I decided to incorporate into the final episode of the radio series. So Stephen Oliver set it to music. The idea was that the opening of the song would be sung by John Le Mesurier as Bilbo, and that the theme would then be taken up by a boy soprano. But the poem's copyright owner was unimpressed with John's admittedly shaky rendition, and so in the final broadcast he was only allowed to speak the words. Fortunately, however, producer Jane Morgan kept the original demo tape. I have to say I hadn't heard it in 20 years, but we fished it out, blew the dust off it, and popped it into the portable tape recorder. And this is it. Bilbo's Last Song.
Day is ended, dim my eyes, but journey long before me lies. Farewell, friends, I hear the call, the ships beside the stony wall. Foam is white and waves are grey, beyond the sunset leads my way. Foam is salt, the wind is free, I hear the rising of the sea.
You see why I loved his performance. I think it's a beautiful moment. And of course the imperfections of his voice make it all the more telling, and therefore when the boy soprano with the perfect voice takes over, the whole point is made.
I always thought it was a very moving way to end the story, and hearing him, I haven't heard that in 20 years, but hearing him performing the song, it seems to me to encapsulate everything about the end of The Lord of the Rings, because it's a story where people have gone through this most enormous and phenomenal hardship and difficulty, only at the end to have to give it all up themselves, having saved the world, and pass away. And there is the ending of their world, and there is a sense of that. There's a sense of completion, tiredness, weariness, but hope for something new, all summed up in that voice.
Yes.
Q 105A, take 3.
Brian Sibley presented Fired by the Ring. The producer in Bristol was Francis Burns. And you might like to know that J.R.R. Tolkien, an audio portrait presented by Brian Sibley, has been released by the BBC Radio Collection on audio cassette and CD.